My name's Steve. I'm 35. Average height, dark hair, brown eyes, just your typical guy. Nothing too special. I mean, I'm not bad looking, but I'm definitely not the type you'd see on a fitness magazine cover either. And honestly, I never thought it mattered. My wife, Nancy, used to feel the same way. Or at least, that's what I believed. We've been married for 6 years now. Life was going well. My career was on the rise. We had a solid savings account, a house, and plenty of plans for the future. Nancy, though, she's the kind of woman people notice. Tall, elegant, with striking blonde hair and sharp blue eyes. Anytime she walked into a room, heads turned. But she never seemed to care about that kind of attention. Or at least, I never picked up on it. Anyway, things took a strange turn at a friend's birthday party. It was one of those laid-back gatherings, too much wine, late-night conversations that gradually drifted into weird territory. We were all sitting in a circle, chatting about dreams, goals, and future kids, the usual. And then Nancy said something that made the whole room pause. She just threw it out there, almost too casually, something about wanting her child to be from another man. For a second, everything froze. My brain stalled, trying to process what I had just heard. Did she really say that? Before I could react, she quickly waved it off with a nervous laugh. Oh, I didn't mean it like that. I was just joking. Like, imagine if we had a kid with Scandinavian genes. She went on about how a baby with blonde hair and blue eyes would probably grow up looking like a supermodel. A few people chuckled awkwardly, trying to brush it off, but I caught the way some of them raised their eyebrows. Even I wasn't sure how to respond. So, I went the easy route. I made a joke out of it. Sure. And while we're at it, let's throw in some Viking strength too, I said with a grin. Everyone laughed, the conversation moved on, and that moment passed. But it stuck with me. It was one of those comments that you try to shrug off at first, thinking, okay, just a slip-up after a few drinks. But later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. Why would she even say something like that? At the time, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I thought it was a random, offhand joke. Turns out, I was about to get hit with something much bigger. The next few days felt off. Nancy started making these strange little comments about genetics and physical traits, nothing outright alarming, but just odd enough to notice. We'd be watching TV, and she'd suddenly go, "Look at that actor's jawline. You think that's all genetics? Or does he spend 15 hours a week in the gym? Or, wow, those eyes. Imagine having a kid with eyes like that." At first, I didn't think much of it. People talk about celebrities all the time. No big deal, right? But then, it wasn't just about celebrities. We'd be out running errands, and she'd casually whisper, "That guy's got to be over 7 feet tall. I wonder if he's Scandinavian. They're always tall." I gave her a weird look and laughed it off. "What's with you and Scandinavians lately?" She just smirked and didn't answer. I tried not to overanalyze it. People go through weird little phases, like suddenly getting obsessed with fitness or binge-watching conspiracy documentaries. But this felt different. Then one night, over dinner, she dropped something even stranger. She mentioned she'd been reading up on genetics, something about a blog or a TikTok influencer who talked about optimal gene combinations and passing down the best traits. I nearly choked on my pasta. Superior traits? You're serious right now? I shot her a skeptical look. She didn't even hesitate. Yeah, it's fascinating. There's research showing that certain physical features can actually give people a better chance at success in life. And that was the moment I realized something was seriously off. She went on about how taller men tend to earn more money and how people with symmetrical faces are seen as more trustworthy. I just stared at her. Okay, but what does that have to do with us? I asked. Pretty sure we're doing just fine without obsessing over genetic superiority. She sighed, like I was just too blind to see some grand philosophical truth. Steve, I just want the best for our future kids. Don't you? At that moment, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or argue. Instead, I let it go and changed the subject. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The way she talked about it, so calm, so certain, was starting to get under my skin. Then, a few weeks later, things took a turn for the worse. Nancy became obsessed. She spent hours scrolling through social media, watching interviews with so-called genetic experts, and reading up on inheritance patterns. She even started digging into her own ancestry, going on about how her family had roots in Scandinavia, like that somehow proved a point. And then, one night, while we were just watching a movie, she hit me with another curveball. Completely out of nowhere, she said, "I've been thinking, we should seriously consider how genetics will shape our kids' future." I set down the remote, narrowing my eyes. "Nancy, what are you even talking about?" She shrugged, like this was just another casual conversation. "I'm just saying, we need to be strategic. If we want our kids to have every advantage in life, we should aim for the best gene pool possible." I scoffed. "You make it sound like we're breeding racehorses. What's gotten into you?" She folded her arms, giving me that exasperated, "You just don't get it" look. "Steve, this isn't about you. It's about giving our kids the best start in life. People with strong genetics have a head start." Something in my gut twisted. "Are you saying my genes aren't good enough?" Her eyes widened, like she hadn't even considered how messed up that sounded. No. I mean, You're handsome, responsible, smart. It's not about you. But you know how competitive the world is. I shook my head. Competitive? So what? You're scared our kids won't be tall enough to play pro basketball? Or that they won't come out looking like genetically engineered supermodels? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she just looked at me, like she was carefully choosing her next words. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just some weird passing phase. She wasn't going to snap out of it after a few blog posts and TikTok videos. She was dead serious. That night, I lay awake next to her, staring at the ceiling. How do you even begin to reason with someone who's convinced your future kids need to look like they just walked off a runway in Milan? Things were spiraling, and I was caught right in the middle of it. The next few weeks were pure hell. Nancy's obsession went from subtle to full-blown fixation. Every conversation somehow found its way back to genetics. I couldn't even enjoy a simple walk in the park without her making some weird comment. One afternoon, she nodded toward a tall, blonde couple pushing a stroller. Look at them, she muttered. Bet their kids will grow up to be athletes or CEOs. I rolled my eyes. Right. Because I colored totally determined success. She ignored the sarcasm, still staring at them like she was analyzing a science experiment. And it wasn't just the comments anymore. She started acting different, distant, colder. The woman who used to curl up next to me during movie nights now acted like I wasn't even there half the time. And when she did talk to me, it was often some passive-aggressive remark. One night, we were bickering over something stupid, probably dinner, when she suddenly snapped. Maybe if you weren't so average, you'd understand how important this is. I froze. Excuse me. Average. That's what she thought of me now. Her expression shifted, and I could tell she knew she'd crossed a line. Steve, I didn't mean it like that. But it was already out there, and I wasn't sure there was any coming back from it. You know what I'm trying to say. No, Nancy, I really don't. I shot back, my voice rising. Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you regret marrying someone who isn't a 6-foot-tall Nordic god. She let out a sigh and crossed her arms. I'm scared, okay? Scared that our kids won't have the same opportunities as everyone else's. Life is already hard enough. I scoffed. That's ridiculous. Our kids will have love, support, and everything they need to succeed. But you're stuck on this fantasy that genetics are some kind of golden ticket in life. The tension was suffocating. She didn't say anything else that night, but I knew she wasn't letting go of this obsession. And me? I was torn between trying to knock some sense into her and just walking out the door. It only got worse from there. It was like she had already decided I wasn't good enough. Emotionally, she started pulling away, treating me like some kind of genetic dead end. She threw around more statistics, rattling off how taller men supposedly earn more or how symmetrical faces make people more trustworthy, like she was reading from a script. I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, I finally confronted her. Let me get this straight. You think I'm not good enough to be the father of your kids because I'm not tall and blonde? Why did you even marry me, Nancy? For a second, something in her expression softened. Steve, that's not what I'm saying. You're a good man. You're reliable. I love you. But this isn't about us. It's about our future. I let out a bitter laugh. Well, so I'm good enough to be your husband, but not good enough to father your children? Got it. I shook my head, anger boiling inside me. That night, I didn't even bother going to bed. I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together where everything had gone so horribly wrong. This wasn't the woman I married. The woman I married didn't care about superficial nonsense like this. But now, it felt like I was living with a stranger. For the first time, the thought crossed my mind. Maybe this was the beginning of the end. Maybe there was no coming back from this. Before we get into what happened next, make sure to subscribe to the channel. But trust me, things only got worse. At this point, Nancy wasn't even trying to hide her obsession anymore. She talked about perfect genes like it was just normal dinner conversation. And then, one night, she took things to a whole new level. We were in the living room, barely talking. I was flipping through channels, avoiding any deep conversations, when she suddenly spoke. Steve, I've been thinking. Her tone was way too calm, and I already knew whatever was coming next was going to be bad. I muted the TV and turned to her. Thinking about what? She hesitated for a second, just long enough for my stomach to tighten, then dropped the bomb. Maybe we should look into sperm donation. You know, from someone with ideal traits. I blinked, trying to process if I had just heard her right. What? Don't get upset, she said quickly, like she already knew how insane this sounded. I'm just saying we should explore all our options. I could feel my pulse pounding. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to keep my voice steady. Options? I repeated. You mean having some random guy's DNA in our child instead of mine? Do you even hear yourself right now? She sighed like I was the one being unreasonable. Steve, calm down. It's not like I'm saying I want to sleep with someone else. It's just a medical procedure. Oh, well, that makes so much better, I snapped, throwing up my hands. Thanks for clarifying, Nancy. Now I feel so much more secure knowing you want to design our baby instead of having one with my so-called inferior genes. Her arms crossed, frustration clear on her face. You're twisting my words. No, Nancy. I was finally seeing them for exactly what they were. You just refuse to understand where I'm coming from. No, Nancy, I understand perfectly. I said, locking eyes with her. You've decided that I'm not good enough. That our future kids need some kind of genetic upgrade because you can't stand the idea of them looking like me. She rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. I let out a bitter laugh. Dramatic? Nancy, you've spent months obsessing over this nonsense. You've compared me to random tall, blonde strangers. You've thrown statistics at me like they prove some undeniable truth. And now? Now you're actually suggesting I get replaced by a sperm donor. I stood up, my heart pounding. If anyone's being dramatic, it's you. Nancy pushed herself up from the couch too, her expression firm. I'm not trying to hurt you, Steve. I just want to make sure our children have the best opportunities. Why can't you see that? Because you've lost your mind. I shot back. You've let this insane fantasy take over your life, and you don't even realize how much damage you're doing. Do you even care how I feel? For a moment, her face softened. But it was too late. I couldn't unhear what she'd said. That night, I couldn't stand being in the same house as her. I needed space. Grabbing my keys, I walked out the door, leaving her standing in the living room. I drove aimlessly for a while, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just some petty argument. This was bigger than that. This was a fundamental crack in our marriage, one I wasn't sure we could ever fix. When I finally made it home a few hours later, Nancy was waiting for me. She looked exhausted, but her face was unreadable. So, are you going to stay out all night from now on? She asked quietly. I'm thinking about it, I replied coldly. I walked right past her without another word and headed straight for the spare bedroom. I was done. Done with the conversations. Done with the statistics. Done with the cold looks and the constant feeling that I wasn't enough. The next few days were tense. We barely spoke. The house was silent, thick with unspoken words. I could tell Nancy was confused, maybe even hurt, but I just didn't care anymore. I was mentally checked out. Every time I looked at her, all I could think about was that conversation. The fact that she had seriously considered a sperm donor, it was like a punch to the gut. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't live like this anymore. The decision was already made, even if it felt like a knife twisting inside me. And it was only a matter of time before things exploded again. Nancy, of course, had no idea just how far she had pushed me. She thought this was just another rough patch, something we could work through. But for me, this wasn't a bump in the road. This was the edge of a cliff, and I had already fallen. One night, after another stretch of cold, unbearable silence, she tried to revisit the conversation. We were sitting at the dining table, eating in near total quiet, when she finally spoke. I think we need to be practical about this, Steve, she said softly, like she was trying to avoid setting me off. I set my fork down and just stared at her. Practical about what, exactly? She let out a long sigh, rubbing her temples like I was the difficult one. About children. About how we move forward. I know you hate the idea of sperm donation, so I've been looking into other options. My stomach dropped. What kind of options? Calm down, she said quickly. I'm just talking hypothetically. I was reading about how some couples use surrogates, or they meet people who are willing to help in non-traditional ways. My pulse started pounding in my ears. Non-traditional ways? You mean finding some guy to? No, she cut me off, shaking her head. Of course not. But I wasn't sure I believed her anymore. I'm not saying I'd cheat or anything like that, Nancy said quickly. But plenty of people explore alternative options. You have to admit, it's at least worth discussing. I stared at her, completely speechless. Nancy, are you seriously sitting here at this table, telling me we should go out and find someone to make a baby with? What the hell is wrong with you? She hesitated, probably realizing just how insane she sounded. Then she let out a nervous laugh and waved her hand like she could erase the words she'd just said. You're overreacting. It was just a thought. Oh, just a thought, I repeated, standing up and glaring down at her. And you actually think I'm going to sit here and listen to you casually brainstorm ways to replace me as the father of our kids? Jesus, Nancy, I'm done. Her eyes widened in shock. Steve, wait, you don't mean that. I do, I said, my voice low but firm. I've been done for a while. You've pushed me past my breaking point with this genetic fantasy nonsense. I don't even recognize you anymore. Steve, come on, she pleaded, standing up and stepping toward me. You can't just walk away over a misunderstanding. This isn't a misunderstanding, I snapped. You've been chipping away at me for months, making me feel like I'm not good enough, like I'm some kind of placeholder for your dream man. And now? Now you want to talk about alternatives? Screw that. I'm done being your experiment. She folded her arms, her voice turning sharp. Don't you think you're being selfish? You're making this all about your feelings instead of thinking about our future family. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm selfish? That's rich, coming from the person who wants to custom order a child from a sperm bank catalog. Her expression hardened. You're impossible. And you're delusional. I shot back. I grabbed a bag and started packing. Enjoy your perfect future, Nancy. But it won't be with me. She followed me to the front door, her voice trembling with disbelief. Steve, wait. You don't have to do this. Let's just talk. I'm done talking, I said without even turning around. All you care about is your fantasy of a perfect family. Well, here's a reality check. There's no such thing. I stepped outside, walked to my car, and pulled out of the driveway without another word. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there anymore. A few hours later, my phone rang. I let it ring a couple of times before finally picking up. "What do you want?" I asked flatly. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Are you coming home?" I exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. "No, Nancy. I'm not coming home. I need space. I need time to think. And honestly, you should do the same." "Steve," she said, her voice almost pleading. "I don't understand why you're so angry. I thought we were just having a rational conversation." I closed my eyes, shaking my head. "Jesus, Nancy." She still didn't get it. "You've been tearing me down for months. Comparing me to some imaginary, perfect man in your head. Making me feel like I'm not enough." My grip tightened on the phone. "How do you not see how damaging that is?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then, in barely more than a whisper, she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Well, you did," I said, my voice cold and steady. "Look, I'm done arguing. We're not on the same page anymore. Hell, we're not even in the same book." That was the last real conversation we ever had. The next day, I called a lawyer. Nancy was still in shock, I think. She didn't fight the divorce much, probably because she was too busy convincing herself that I was the one who had lost my mind. But in reality, I was finally taking control of my life again. The divorce process moved fast. Too fast, maybe. Nancy barely put up a fight. She didn't try to drag things out, didn't contest anything, didn't complicate the division of assets. It was like she couldn't quite process that this was really happening. Meanwhile, I stayed laser-focused, meetings with my lawyer, setting up my own bank account, looking for a new place. She reached out once or twice, but it was awkward, pointless. The last time she called, she said, "Steve, I think you're overreacting. Maybe you're just stressed out from everything. We can figure this out together." I almost laughed at how delusional that sounded. "Nancy, I'm not stressed," I told her. "I'm done. We're too far gone. You made it crystal clear that I don't fit into your plan anymore, and I can't be married to someone who sees me as a genetic liability." Silence. No arguments, no apologies, just silence. Maybe, for the first time, she was realizing how deep this cut ran. The divorce was finalized quietly. Friends and family started hearing bits and pieces, and soon, the questions started rolling in. "What happened? Are you really splitting up?" I didn't give them details. I wasn't about to explain Nancy's obsession with designer babies. Let her deal with that embarrassment herself. But Nancy? She didn't handle the social fallout as smoothly as she probably expected. I heard through mutual friends that people weren't exactly supportive of her choices. Some were subtle, others, not so much. One guy at a party even joked, "Well, now you're free to find that Viking you've been dreaming about." Apparently, she didn't take that well. Good. Maybe it was time for her to face reality. Life after divorce is weird. There's no other way to put it. You get used to having someone around all the time, and then suddenly, it's just you. I moved into a small apartment, something temporary while I figured out my next steps. Kept myself busy. Hiking, hitting the gym, spending time with friends who didn't want to talk about Nancy. Dating? Not even on my radar. I barely had the energy to think about relationships. I needed to rebuild myself first. But some nights were rough. Lying awake at 3 a.m., my mind would wander back to everything. The arguments. The absurd conversations. The way things fell apart. I questioned myself. Could I have handled it differently? Did I overreact? But deep down, I already knew the truth. Nancy wasn't the same woman I married. She let this toxic obsession consume her. And there was nothing I could have done to save her from that. As for Nancy, I heard she wasn't doing great either. She threw herself into work, barely socialized. The woman who once thrived on attention had pulled back from everyone. Maybe she was finally realizing that chasing perfection isn't all it's cracked up to be. She tried reaching out a couple more times. Sent texts like, "Hey, can we talk?" And, "I've been thinking about everything." I never responded. I wasn't going back. I wasn't reopening wounds that were finally starting to heal. Sometimes, I wonder if she really gets it. If she truly understands how much she hurt me. But that's not my responsibility anymore. I'm moving forward, one step at a time. And honestly, I feel lighter. No more twisted expectations. No more competing with some imaginary perfect version of myself. It's just me now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I wish you a great day ahead.